It was a bitter February night in 1943, and HMS Persephone, a British U-class submarine, floated silently beneath the frozen waves of the Aegean Sea. Its steel hull creaked faintly as the water pressed against it, a constant reminder of the crushing depth surrounding them. Lieutenant Commander William Hargreaves, at 38, paced the narrow control room, the dim red light reflecting off his furrowed brow. He had the composure of a man who had survived too many skirmishes to fear another, yet tonight a cold unease gripped him. Somewhere out there, German patrols prowled the waters, their sonar pings cutting through the darkness like whispers of death. Every decision mattered, every miscalculation could be fatal. He ran a hand across the worn wooden edge of the console, thinking of the last message from Naval Command. Avoid contact. Reach open waters. Patrol suspended until further orders. That instruction now seemed laughably impossible. The sub was trapped. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Among the crew was Chief Engineer Edward Eddie Mallory, a wiry man of 35 whose eccentric brilliance had earned him both admiration and wary glances. Before the war, Eddie had tinkered with small steam engines in his father's workshop in Devon, building odd contraptions that often worked spectacularly or exploded. He had a mind wired for improvisation, a mixture of stubborn ingenuity and reckless daring that made him invaluable in crises. Now, aboard Persephone, he stared at the damaged port propeller shaft, twisted and useless after a collision with a submerged rock near the Greek coast. The other propeller had been compromised as well, the bearings scorched from overuse and the casing dented from debris. At 5 knots, the sub could barely navigate. At 15 knots, it could almost escape detection. But the distance to safety demanded 30 knots, a speed no U-class submarine could achieve without extraordinary measures. Eddie's mind raced. The rest of the crew moved silently in the shadows, aware of the danger but relying entirely on Eddie's brilliance. Petty Officer Harris checked the torpedo racks, ensuring that nothing was loose. The sonar operator, a lanky young man of 24 named Thomas Finch, tapped nervously on the console, monitoring the approaching blips that indicated enemy vessels. Lieutenant Commander Hargreaves' hands were steady, but his eyes betrayed his worry. "Eddie," he said quietly, leaning over the bulkhead, "any ideas?" Eddie's eyes gleamed in the red light. "Maybe we don't need ideas. Maybe we just need guts and a little scrap metal." He crawled into the cramped engine room, tools clanging like a clandestine orchestra. The smell of oil, burning insulation, and metal dust filled the air. He crouched by the main shaft, his fingers probing the damaged propeller, tracing the bends and fractures. Behind him, the rest of the engineers and mechanics followed, knowing that whatever Eddie attempted would be reckless, dangerous, and possibly their only chance at survival. For a moment, the silence of the submarine seemed absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the auxiliary pumps and the distant creaking of the hull under water pressure. Eddie's plan began to take shape in his mind. The sub carried a small cache of spare propellers, mostly intended for maintenance or emergency replacements, but never for the extreme task he had in mind. He envisioned rigging the spare propellers to an auxiliary shaft, fashioning a system that could multiply thrust and push Persephone far beyond its design limits. It was madness. Every calculation he ran mentally seemed to defy the laws of physics. The sub's hull could only withstand so much torque. The bearings would likely seize. The frame might even snap under stress. Yet, in desperation, madness often became a tool. Hours passed as Eddie and his team worked, each movement precise yet frantic. He welded, clamped, and aligned the spares, measuring angles and testing rotations with improvised gauges. "She'll vibrate like a wild stallion," Eddie muttered to himself, tightening the final bolt. Petty Officer Harris peered over his shoulder. "Do you really think this will work?" he asked, doubt creeping into his voice. Eddie didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tested the new configuration, spinning the propellers by hand. They whirred with a strange efficiency, cutting through the lubricated oil like a whisper. "If she holds, she'll outrun them all," Eddie said finally, a hint of a smile on his soot-streaked face. Meanwhile, outside the submarine, the first light of dawn began to pierce the horizon. Faint streaks of pink and orange painted the sky, a cruel irony as the crew faced the possibility of destruction beneath that very dawn. German destroyers patrolled the area, their sonar signals echoing faintly in the hull. Each ping was a heartbeat, a warning that time was slipping. Thomas Finch's hands trembled slightly on the sonar controls. "2 blips closing fast," he whispered. Hargreaves nodded. "Brace yourselves. This is going to get rough." Eddie gave the final nod to the commander. "Ready when you are," he said, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. Hargreaves gripped the controls, slowly turning the throttle. The submarine shuddered. At first, the speedometer ticked sluggishly, but as the auxiliary propellers engaged, a new rhythm took over, violent yet controlled. 5 knots became 10. 10 became 15. The hull vibrated under 30% more torque than it was rated for. The crew held on, faces pale, hearts hammering. They could hear the groans of the hull in protest, yet it endured. 20 knots. 25. The engine room was a cacophony of clanging metal and hissing steam. Eddie's grin widened. 30 knots, he breathed, voice shaking with both fear and exhilaration. The destroyers above reacted immediately. Flares burst in the early morning sky, bathing the water in harsh white light. Depth charges exploded nearby, sending shockwaves through the submarine. Hargreaves barked orders. "Evasive maneuvers, hard starboard, brace for impact." The sub dipped and twisted, diving under the waves like a steel leviathan. Every second was a gamble, every motion risked catastrophic failure. Yet, against all odds, Eddie's makeshift system held. The water rushed past the hull at unprecedented speed, currents whipping through the portholes, carrying the taste of salt and the faint, acrid smell of oil. Inside, the crew's tension was palpable. Petty Officer Harris gritted his teeth, gripping the rails as the sub pitched violently. Thomas Finch's fingers flew over the sonar controls, noting each approaching contact. Lieutenant Commander Hargreaves adjusted the helm continuously, calculating distance, speed, and depth with razor precision. And Eddie, covered in oil and sweat, continued to monitor the auxiliary propeller system, making minute adjustments, tightening bolts, and whispering calculations under his breath. Every action could mean the difference between survival and obliteration. The sub's bow struck a pocket of turbulent water, throwing several crew members against bulkheads. A single warning alarm rang a pressure imbalance, but Eddie responded instantly, releasing a valve, diverting coolant, and stabilizing the system. The sub lurched forward, faster than ever before. The speedometer needle quivered on 30 knots. For the first time, the crew allowed themselves to hope. They were not out of danger, not by a long shot, but they were moving faster than anyone thought possible. Hours seemed like minutes as Persephone carved a path through enemy waters, German destroyers, adjusted course, depth charges raining down in futile attempts to halt the escape. Eddie recalibrated thrust angles repeatedly, sweat running into his eyes, hands numb from vibrations. The sub twisted and dipped with the grace of a predator, barely avoiding torpedo paths and sonar sweeps. Above, the morning sun reflected off the waves, glinting like the eyes of unseen enemies. Below, the submarine surged relentlessly, propelled by ingenuity, desperation, and the mad brilliance of one man. By mid-morning, the destroyers were behind them, disoriented and unable to follow the unconventional escape. The crew began to relax slightly, though exhaustion weighed heavily on every shoulder. Hargreaves allowed himself a brief glance at Eddie. The engineer, covered in grime and blood from a minor cut, was smiling faintly, eyes alight with the thrill of triumph. "We made it," Eddie said softly, almost in disbelief. "We actually made it." The submarine finally reached deeper waters, where the risk of detection decreased. Hargreaves ordered a temporary halt to assess damage. The auxiliary propeller system had survived, but the main shafts had been stressed beyond recommended limits. The hull bore dents and scratches, but the vessel was intact. Crew members slumped into bunks and along bulkheads, each drawing deep, shaking breaths. The danger was not over, but survival was certain for the first time that morning. Eddie walked slowly through the engine room, surveying the work. The rigged propellers had achieved what no one believed possible. They had turned a doomed submarine into a 30-knot escape machine, defying both physics and expectation. Hargreaves approached, clapping a hand on Eddie's shoulder. "You've done the impossible, Edward. The Navy may not believe this, but you've saved every soul aboard." Eddie nodded, allowing himself a small smile. "Sometimes, sir, the impossible is just an idea waiting for the right hands." As night fell over the port, Aegean, the crew finally allowed themselves to rest. The sub floated quietly beneath the moonlight, battered but victorious, a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and daring. Above, distant stars glittered indifferently, but inside Persephone, hope burned brighter than ever. The mad engineer had turned scrap into salvation, and the story of that night would live on, whispered among sailors, engineers, and dreamers for decades to come. In the years after the war, HMS Persephone was decommissioned, and the extraordinary auxiliary propeller system was catalogued only in obscure naval records. Eddie Mallory returned to a quiet life, often gazing at the sea with a faint, knowing smile. Few ever knew the details of that miraculous escape, the night when a madman and his ingenuity had defied the odds. Yet for those aboard the sub that night, the memory was indelible, a frozen moment in February of 1943, when scrap metal became salvation, and human brilliance outpaced the very engines of war. The damage was severe. One propeller was jammed beyond repair, the other groaned under minimal load, spinning only erratically with a rasping sound that echoed through the hull. At the current speed, HMS Persephone could barely manage 5 knots, far too slow to evade the encroaching German destroyers, whose sonar pings grew ever louder in the icy Aegean night. Every second spent idling increased the danger. Lieutenant Commander William Hargreaves' knuckles were white as he gripped the helm, scanning the dim sonar display. The faint blips danced across the screen, each one a harbinger of death. Above the water, searchlights occasionally pierced the waves, and the cold wind whistled through hatches, carrying the distant echo of enemy engines. Eddie Mallory, the submarine's 35-year-old chief engineer, crouched amid a chaotic array of spare parts, propellers, bearings, metal plates, and lengths of pipe scavenged from previous missions. His hands moved, like lightning, calculating angles, torque, and thrust in real time, assembling a daring, improvised configuration that seemed to defy logic. Sub-Lieutenant Jameson, 29 and relatively new to undersea warfare, peered over Eddie's shoulder with a mixture of fascination and terror. "Eddie, you're mad," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the auxiliary pumps and the clanging of tools against the metal floor. "Mad? Maybe," Eddie replied, a thin, almost feral smile spreading across his face. "But we're not trying to win a race, we're trying to survive." His voice carried an odd confidence, the kind born from years of trial, error, and improbable success. He slid a bent propeller onto a makeshift shaft, the metal squealing under pressure, and began adjusting the clamps to stabilize the angle of thrust. Sparks flew from a welding torch as he joined the pieces, the heat and light dancing across his soot-streaked face. The crew watched in tense silence, hearts hammering, eyes wide with a combination of horror and awe. They had seen Eddie do incredible things before, but this was beyond recklessness. It was genius on the knife's edge of catastrophe. Hours passed like minutes. The submarine vibrated subtly beneath them, a living thing of steel, oil, and sweat. The smell of engine, grease, and burning metal filled the cramped corridors. Eddie crouched over the auxiliary shaft again, calculating the water flow, the expected revolutions per minute, and the torque distribution. He bent over, wrench in hand, muttering numbers under his breath. Angle 2 degrees, add 15 rotations. No, 25. Increase thrust by 5%. The sheer audacity of his plan was frightening. The sub was a labyrinth of corridors, hissing pipes, and vibrating machinery, yet Eddie treated it like a workshop, a place where invention could overcome physics itself. Outside, the sonar blips drew closer. The German destroyers were relentless, calculating, their movements precise and unforgiving. A distant explosion from a depth charge sent a tremor through the hull, rattling loose tools and causing a burst of steam to hiss from the auxiliary system. Sub-Lieutenant Jameson swore softly, gripping the railing. Hargreaves did not speak, only adjusted the controls minutely, trusting Eddie's judgment implicitly. The sub quivered with anticipation, as if aware that the next few minutes would decide life or death. Eddie finally straightened, wiping oil from his face and hands, his chest heaving from exertion. He surveyed the makeshift escape rig, a combination of welded propellers, reinforced shafts, and improvised bearings. Every component was slightly askew, every connection a gamble, yet together they formed a system capable of something previously thought impossible, to push the submarine far beyond its designed limits. His eyes gleamed with that dangerous combination of brilliance and defiance. "Test her," he said. Hargreaves nodded, fingers tightening on the throttle. The sub shuddered as he slowly engaged the auxiliary system. At first, the movement was hesitant, uneven. The port propeller whined under pressure, the metal flexing and groaning. Sweat ran down Eddie's face as he monitored every vibration, every pitch, every nuance. 5 knots. The speedometer ticked sluggishly. The sub trembled, but it moved. A small cheer erupted from the crew, quickly stifled as the danger remained ever present. Eddie leaned forward, adjusting the clamps with a wrench, eyes darting between gauges and the shifting flow of water past the hull. 10 knots. The submarine surged forward, shaking violently, but holding. The makeshift system began to stabilize under the strain, channels of water redirected efficiently by the jury-rigged propellers. Hargreaves' hands were steady, guiding the vessel, each movement calculated. 15 knots. The hull shivered, pipes vibrated. Every bolt and weld groaned in protest. 20 knots, Eddie whispered, his voice barely audible over the mechanical cacophony. His grin widened, one side of his face smeared with oil and sweat. The crew exchanged glances, fear mingled with disbelief. The sub was moving faster than any U-class had ever moved under its own power. It was a speed no one had thought possible, and yet here it was, surging through the freezing waters with reckless determination. Depth charges exploded in the distance, sending tremors through the sub. Water pressure surged against the hull. Hargreaves barked orders, coordinating evasive maneuvers with meticulous precision. Eddie adjusted the auxiliary propeller angles, twisting valves and tightening bolts mid-motion. The sub rocked like a wild stallion, yet its momentum grew. 25 knots. The water rushed past with ferocity, the sub slicing through the waves with unprecedented speed. The crew clung to rails and consoles as the vibration intensified, metal groaning, in rhythm with the propulsion. Thomas Finch, the sonar operator, was pale and trembling. "They're not catching up," he muttered, disbelief lacing his voice. Hargreaves allowed himself a small nod. "Not if we hold this course," he replied. The sub swayed and dipped, narrowly avoiding a series of sonar pings that indicated depth charge patterns. Eddie's hands never stopped moving. He was adjusting thrust, recalculating rotation, even twisting the angle of the main shaft slightly to compensate for turbulence. Every movement was a gamble. One wrong turn, one miscalculation, and the hull could fracture, the system fail catastrophically. The minutes dragged by, though they felt like seconds. The sub's speedometer quivered, then surged 28 knots. The crew could feel the water's resistance, the immense force pushing against the hull, the vibration through every floor plate, every bulkhead. Eddie's grin grew wider, his eyes alight with both fear and exhilaration. 30 knots, he whispered to himself, voice hoarse but triumphant. It was a number previously unattainable for a submarine of their class, a number that now represented life, hope, and the sheer audacity of human invention. Hargreaves glanced at Eddie through the dim red light. "You've done it," he said quietly, almost reverently. Eddie allowed himself a brief nod, not taking his eyes off the gauges. "We'll survive," he muttered. The sub surged forward, 30 knots tearing through the waves, the water boiling past the reinforced propellers. Above them, the destroyers adjusted course, flares slicing the sky, but they could not match the submarine's impossible speed. The crew allowed themselves a moment of cautious relief, clinging to the rails, faces pale but eyes alive with hope. The sub, battered, groaning, and vibrating violently, had transformed from a trapped, vulnerable vessel into a streaking phantom propelled by ingenuity, desperation, and audacity. The auxiliary propeller system, born of scrap metal and daring calculations, had achieved the impossible. Sweat and oil coated every surface, yet there was a sense of triumph amid the fear, a recognition that survival, against all odds, was now within reach. Hours later, once the immediate threat had passed, the sub entered deeper, calmer waters. Hargreaves allowed a brief assessment, measuring hull integrity and noting minor structural stress. Pipes had loosened slightly, bolts had shifted under pressure, but the vessel remained intact. Eddie slumped against a bulkhead, breathing heavily, a sheen of oil covering his face. "We actually made it," he said softly, voice trembling from exertion. The crew nodded, some smiling faintly, others staring at the gauges in disbelief. As calm settled over HMS Persephone, the reality of their survival sank in. The auxiliary propeller system had worked beyond anyone's expectation. They had defied physics, engineering limitations, and sheer human logic. The vessel was a testament to improvisation, to courage, to the brilliance and madness of a single engineer who refused to accept doom. Hargreaves approached Eddie, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You've saved us all," he said, quiet but firm. "The Navy may not believe it, but every man aboard owes his life to you." Eddie nodded, allowing himself a rare smile. "Sometimes," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "the impossible is just waiting for the right hands to make it real." The crew of HMS Persephone, exhausted but alive, settled into watch rotations, monitoring the instruments, maintaining the fragile balance of their improvised system. Above them, the Aegean Sea glittered under the rising sun, indifferent to the extraordinary feat unfolding beneath its waves. In the years to come, the story of that night would circulate quietly among submariners and engineers, often dismissed as exaggeration or legend. Yet those aboard HMS Persephone remembered every detail: the vibration of the hull, the hiss of the auxiliary propellers, the taste of fear and salt in their mouths, and the wild, improbable triumph of human ingenuity. Eddie Mallory's name would survive, whispered among the few who knew, a testament to daring, desperation, and the extraordinary power of the mind when faced with impossible odds. Dawn approached, casting a grey, icy light over the restless waters of the Aegean Sea, yet there would be no peace for HMS Persephone. The German destroyers had triangulated her last known position, their sonar pings growing sharper and more insistent, reverberating through the steel hull like a sinister heartbeat. Every sailor aboard felt the tension as if it were a physical weight pressing down on their chests. The depth charges began again, a relentless cascade of thunderous explosions that shook the submarine violently, metal groaning under the force. Pipes rattled, gauges swung wildly, and torpedo racks shuddered as though anticipating the worst. The crew clung to railings, knuckles white, stomachs twisting, praying that the hull would hold. Lieutenant Commander William Hargreaves, 38, gritted his teeth and adjusted the helm, feeling the trembling vibrations pass from the hull through his arms. Above, the faint dawn sky betrayed nothing of the nightmare below. Eddie Mallory, 35, crouched over the auxiliary propeller system, his hands slick with engine oil and sweat. He twisted valves and adjusted pitch, eyes darting between the gauges and the whirring, improvised machinery that was their only hope. "She's unstable," Hargreaves said, voice tight, eyes scanning the sonar display where the enemy's vessels closed the net. The submarine shivered violently as another depth charge detonated nearby, sending a wave of pressure against the reinforced bulkheads. "Instability is temporary." Eddie shot back, his voice raw with effort. "Survival is permanent." The words carried a strange certainty, born of both madness and genius. He read the vibrations, predicted the angles, and calculated the forces as though he were dancing with physics itself. Every adjustment of the auxiliary propeller system caused the submarine to surge forward, shivering and groaning, yet obeying the commands of its reluctant master. The speedometer climbed. 10 knots, then 15, then 20. The sub groaned like a living creature in pain yet exhilaration, responding to Eddie's improvised adjustments. Every bulkhead vibrated with the strain, every pipe screamed in protest, yet the vessel accelerated, cutting through the frigid water with a desperate grace. Torpedo racks clattered violently as if applauding the audacity, the metallic symphony echoing through the hull like a war drum. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 25 knots, the U-class, submarine, never designed for such speed, raced across the Aegean like a ghost, a streak of steel and ingenuity propelled by raw desperation. The crew braced themselves against the railings, faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief and fear. Each burst of speed caused the hull to pitch and sway violently, yet it held together, a testament to both the original construction and the cunning madness of Eddie Mallory. He twisted the auxiliary propellers again, adjusting angles and thrust, sweat dripping into the oil-streaked floor, muttering calculations under his breath. Add 2 degrees, increase RPM by 4, torque balance, adjust counterflow. The words barely carried over the din, yet every motion was precise, every command calculated with terrifying skill. The destroyers, now visibly alerted to the sub's sudden acceleration, retaliated with another round of depth charges. The explosions erupted like firecrackers underwater, sending shockwaves that rattled instruments and threw men off balance. Thomas Finch, the sonar operator, 32, clutched the console with trembling hands. "They're everywhere," he muttered, voice tight, teeth clenched. Hargreaves' eyes narrowed, scanning the readouts. "Not everywhere," he said grimly, guiding the helm with meticulous precision. "But close enough." The submarine heaved under the repeated concussions, groaning as if the steel itself were questioning its own limits. Eddie adjusted the system again, twisting, hammering, tightening clamps that threatened to shear under pressure. Sparks flew from a contact point where metal rubbed against metal, momentarily lighting his soot-streaked face. He could hear the faint creak of stressed shafts, the vibration of water flowing past the hull, the straining of bearings designed for a maximum of 15 knots. Yet here they were, moving faster than any U-class had ever been expected to, surging through the icy waves with reckless determination. The crew's initial fear gave way to awe. They watched the water churn around the hull, the wake boiling like a miniature tempest. Hargreaves leaned over the console, scanning the sonar, noting the patterns of depth charges and plotting evasive angles. Eddie's system responded like a living organism, compensating for each sudden surge, twisting, turning, propelling them forward with a speed and efficiency that defied engineering manuals. 15 minutes of this tense ballet had passed, yet the sub held together, riding the waves with audacious momentum. 28 knots, Eddie whispered, almost to himself, eyes glittering with a mixture of fear and triumph. Hargreaves allowed himself a cautious smile. The sub, battered and trembling, had become a phantom streaking through the sea. Each crew member felt the terrifying exhilaration of moving faster than designed, of trusting a makeshift machine cobbled together from scrap and desperation. Jameson, pale and gripping the railing, shook his head. "I don't know whether to be terrified or grateful," he muttered. Eddie shot him a grin, greasy and wild. "Both, my boy, both." The destroyers were relentless. But HMS Persephone's newfound speed and erratic course began to confuse them. Depth charges fell slightly off target, exploding in clouds of turbulent water that rocked the submarine but could not stop it. The vessel's hull shuddered under each concussive impact, yet it remained intact, carrying its crew through chaos like a fragile, determined spirit. Every turn, every surge, was a careful negotiation with physics, a conversation in motion, where failure meant death and success meant survival. As the minutes dragged on, dawn's grey light began to filter through the narrow periscope lenses. The water around them glimmered with the muted reflection of the rising sun, indifferent to the desperate fight unfolding beneath. Hargreaves adjusted depth and course, guiding the vessel through increasingly shallow waters where the destroyers dared not follow easily. Eddie's hands never stopped moving. He recalculated angles, adjusted RPMs, and twisted the auxiliary shafts with precise, fluid motions. The sub surged to 29 knots, the water boiling around the hull, the sound of rushing currents echoing like a symphony of survival. 30 knots, Eddie muttered, eyes wide, sweat mixing with oil streaking his face. The sub responded immediately, shuddering, vibrating, yet accelerating with incredible force. The crew could feel the pressure through every floor plate, every bulkhead, yet it was a force that promised life. Hargreaves allowed himself a small exhale. For the first time in hours, he felt a flicker of hope. The impossible was happening. A U-class submarine, crippled and damaged, was moving faster than anyone had thought possible, cutting through the waves like a silver arrow. Depth charges continued to fall, but their impact was less precise, less effective. The Germans could not anticipate the sub-speed or the erratic movements induced by the auxiliary propeller system. HMS Persephone weaved through explosions, each near miss rattling the nerves of the crew, yet the system held. Eddie's improvisation had created something extraordinary, a machine of survival born from genius and audacity. The speedometer quivered at 30 knots, the hull vibrating in unison, the submarine slicing through the water with lethal elegance. In the control room, the crew allowed themselves brief glances of incredulous relief. Hargreaves' hands remained on the helm, steady, guiding the vessel through the final gauntlet of destroyers. Jameson exhaled shakily, eyes scanning the water for threats. Finch, still gripping his console, muttered under his breath, "I've never seen anything like it." Eddie merely smiled, wiping oil from his face, and adjusted a final clamp, twisting it just enough to maintain thrust. The sub surged forward, shaking violently, yet holding, together with every bolt and weld protesting in quiet agony. By mid-morning, the destroyers began to falter, miscalculating the sub's position, throwing depth charges too far, exploding harmlessly against empty water. The immediate threat began to recede. HMS Persephone, still vibrating and shuddering under the strain, had outrun the German vessels. The crew, pale and exhausted, allowed themselves a collective exhale. The nightmare was not over, but the first and most dangerous attempt at escape had succeeded. They had defied engineering, physics, and death itself. The vessel, battered and strained to its limits, now moved under its own will, a testament to improvisation, courage, and the audacity of human ingenuity. Eddie slumped against the bulkhead, breathing heavily, sweat and oil dripping from his face. His hands shook from exertion, yet he allowed a faint smile. "We've done it," he murmured, voice hoarse, almost disbelieving. Hargreaves stepped beside him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than survive," he said quietly. "You've given every man aboard a chance at life. The Navy may not believe it, but we all do." The crew nodded in silent agreement, exhausted, trembling, yet filled with a rare and fragile triumph. The sub's speed decreased slightly as they entered calmer waters, the auxiliary propeller system still straining under its makeshift configuration. Yet HMS Persephone was alive, slicing through the waves, carrying its crew away from the immediate threat, propelled by ingenuity and sheer will. The dawn sky stretched over the Aegean, grey and indifferent, the waves glittering with cold light. Yet beneath the surface, a story of daring, invention, and survival had been written in steel, oil, and sweat, a story that would, for years to come, remain whispered among submariners, often dismissed as legend, yet forever etched in the memories of those who had lived it. The first attempt had succeeded. Impossible odds. With a crippled vessel and desperate ingenuity, HMS Persephone had become a streaking phantom, escaping death through sheer audacity. Eddie's auxiliary propeller system, born from scrap metal and reckless brilliance, had transformed the sub from a vulnerable target into a weapon of survival. The crew, exhausted, battered, yet alive, realized the magnitude of what they had achieved. In the chill of the Aegean morning, they dared to hope. For the first time in many harrowing hours, survival felt not just possible, but imminent. The night had deepened over the Aegean, dark and cold, yet every shadow seemed alive with menace. HMS Persephone surged forward beneath the surface, an improvised streak of steel cutting through the waves. Above, German hydrophones had detected movement. Faint clicks and pings reverberated through the hull, unsettling the crew with every vibration. A flare burst high in the sky, illuminating the water and revealing the unmistakable silhouette of the submarine as it sped through the blackness. The enemy had spotted them. From the surface, the dark shape of the destroyer altered course, engines thundering, guns swinging to target the invisible predator below. The sub creaked, shuddered, and groaned under the strain of Eddie Mallory's makeshift propeller system, the auxiliary rig fighting against the enormous forces of water and inertia. "Hold her steady." Lieutenant Commander William Hargreaves, 38, shouted over the mechanical din. His voice, firm and commanding, cut through the controlled chaos. Each crew member gripped the railings, knuckles white, as the metal hull vibrated beneath them like a living creature under duress. Hargreaves' eyes scanned the control panel, noting depth, heading, and sonar blips. He guided the vessel with meticulous care, understanding that even the smallest miscalculation could tear the submarine apart. Eddie's hands moved with lightning precision over valves, levers, and gauges, his face streaked with oil and sweat. The improvised system, constructed from scavenged propellers, spare bearings, and welded scraps, demanded constant attention. He recalibrated thrust vectors, altering propeller angles to minimize drag and maximize forward acceleration. Each adjustment was calculated to fractions of a degree, each turn of the wrench a negotiation with physics itself. The auxiliary system groaned and shrieked in protest, but it held. The sub weaved through sonar pings like a ghost, slipping between the enemy's sensors with an unnatural grace. For several tense minutes, the crew moved as one with the vessel. Thomas Finch, 32, clutched the sonar console, heart pounding in his chest as every ping from the destroyer threatened to betray them. Jameson, 27, monitored depth and angle, adjusting ballast subtly to compensate for the turbulence generated by the auxiliary propellers. Below deck, every bolt, every panel, every connection shivered, under the strain, and yet the crew's confidence grew incrementally with each knot gained. 30 knots, 31, 32. The numbers were staggering, nearly double the sub's standard maximum speed. Then disaster struck. A loose bolt, unnoticed during Eddie's frenzied adjustments, rattled free and struck the auxiliary propeller. Sparks flew, showering a brief staccato of light across the dim engine room. The vibration surged violently through the hull. For a terrifying moment, silence fell over the crew, broken only by the violent thrumming of metal and water. The sub lurched unpredictably, veering dangerously close to the destroyer's projected path. Hargreaves' jaw tightened, eyes flashing with controlled panic. "Brace for impact!" he shouted, though no collision had yet occurred. Eddie, drenched in sweat and oil, dove beneath the control panel, wrench in hand, contorting his body in a space too small for comfort. His face glistened under the dim emergency lights as he located the offending bolt. The sub lurched again as water pressure surged against weakened bulkheads. Eddie tightened, twisted, and recalibrated, every movement precise, every breath measured. Sparks continued to dance around him, the smell of burning metal mixing with the tang of seawater and oil. The auxiliary system groaned one final time, then stabilized, responding to his adjustments like a living entity acknowledging its master. The submarine lurched forward again, faster than before. The speedometer trembled, then steadied at 30 knots, the highest ever recorded for a U-class vessel in such conditions. Hargreaves allowed himself a brief glance at the crew. Wide-eyed, pale, terrified, yet alive, they clung to consoles and rails as though mere willpower could keep them tethered to life. Eddie emerged from beneath the control panel, hair plastered to his forehead, streaks of oil across his cheeks, eyes gleaming with manic triumph. "We're not done yet," he muttered, voice strained. "But we're faster than they thought possible." The destroyer, unaware of the exact sub-position, attempted a new strategy. It veered sharply, dropping a pattern of depth charges designed to envelop the sub in a deadly net. Explosions erupted around them, water and pressure slamming against the hull like massive, invisible fists. Metal groaned and pipes rattled, but Eddie's auxiliary propeller rig absorbed and compensated for each surge. Hargreaves countered with calculated depth adjustments, guiding the sub into a narrow channel where the destroyer's larger hull and slower maneuverability became a liability. Every second felt like a minute, every minute like an hour. The crew, gripped by adrenaline, became almost attuned to the vessel's vibrations. Eddie moved between levers and gauges, hands slick, fingers bleeding slightly from cuts caused by sharp edges of makeshift clamps. His mind raced faster than the sub, predicting torque fluctuations, water turbulence, and mechanical strain. Adjust starboard auxiliary by 0.5 degree. Increase RPM on the port propeller by 200, he muttered to himself, simultaneously shouting instructions to Finch and Jameson. The destroyer fired again, gunfire echoing across the water, and yet HMS Persephone responded with near prescience. The sub twisted, rolled slightly, then surged forward with astonishing force. 31 knots, 32, 33. Hull panels strained audibly, bulkheads groaned. Yet the sub raced as if guided by sheer will. Hargreaves allowed himself a moment to appreciate Eddie's brilliance. Without the auxiliary system, they would have been sitting targets, their fates sealed beneath the crushing waves. But the night had more tests in store. A sudden sonar ping indicated another destroyer closing from the north. Hargreaves tensed, calculating angles and timing. Eddie adjusted the propellers, shifting thrust and torque distribution to account for the new threat. The sub heaved as if shrugging off the enormous force, slicing through the water with terrifying efficiency. Another depth charge detonated nearby, sending a shockwave through the vessel that rattled instruments and threw unsecured objects across the floor. Crew members were slammed against walls and consoles. Yet HMS Persephone continued to accelerate, a steel phantom guided by madness, genius, and desperation. The auxiliary propeller system's limits were being tested to the extreme. Bearings whined, clamps flexed under pressure, and metal groaned as the sub responded to the violent maneuvers. Yet Eddie, drenched, bruised, and exhausted, never faltered. He moved with precise coordination, anticipating every reaction of the water and machinery. "Steady, steady. Increase thrust gradually now," he commanded, wrench in hand, eyes scanning the gauges for microfluctuations. Hargreaves obeyed instinctively, steering with a calm intensity that belied the chaos surrounding them. The sub's speed continued to climb, 34, 35 knots. It had become a weapon of survival, a machine not designed for such rapid movement but forced to exceed every expectation. The destroyer's depth charges continued to fall, but each detonated too far or too late, their patterns miscalculated by the sub's unpredictable movements. Crew members, pale and shaking, could hardly believe the vessel's resilience. They had become passengers on a vessel alive with energy, danger, and ingenuity, a machine that seemed to possess its own consciousness. For 20 grueling minutes, HMS Persephone danced between death and survival, navigating the deadly waters with unprecedented velocity. The crew, hands raw, muscles trembling, hearts hammering, began to realize that Eddie's rig was more than a desperate experiment. It was the difference between life and annihilation. Every adjustment, every recalibration, every twist of a valve was a negotiation with the void. The sub shuddered violently, yet responded instantly, a ballet of engineering and courage unfolding in the depths. Hargreaves allowed himself a fleeting smile as they passed a known minefield, submerged wrecks of previous engagements rising and falling in the sonar display like spectres. "We'll make it," he whispered, voice low, though exhaustion and adrenaline coarsened it. Eddie's hands never stopped moving. Each second demanded attention, each movement dictated survival. Sparks flew as a loose panel shifted, yet Eddie adjusted instantaneously, the sub surging again, faster than it had moments before. At 36 knots, HMS Persephone began to clear the immediate engagement zone. The destroyers, frustrated and confused, fell behind, their sonar pings growing fainter, sporadic, increasingly ineffective. Crew members slumped against consoles and rails, gasping for breath, skin pale, muscles trembling with fatigue. Eddie allowed himself a brief pause, wiping oil and sweat from his face, eyes wide with disbelief at the performance of the machine he had cobbled together from scraps. The auxiliary propeller system, despite its crude construction and frantic assembly, had not failed. It had carried them through a gauntlet of explosions, sonar detections, and near collisions, maintaining unprecedented speed and stability. 37 knots, 38. The hull vibrated and groaned, yet the vessel remained intact, a testament to human ingenuity and sheer audacity. Hargreaves allowed a brief glance at his crew. Wide-eyed, terrified, yet alive, they understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, an escape that defied every expectation, a survival story in motion beneath the frozen waves. By early morning, with the first hints of grey light stretching across the horizon, HMS Persephone had left the destroyers far behind. The sea, indifferent to human struggle, rippled gently, reflecting the waning panic of the crew. The submarine, battered and strained, had achieved the impossible. Eddie slumped against the bulkhead, wrench in hand, and allowed himself the faintest smile. "We survived the night," he muttered. Hargreaves nodded, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "More than survived," he replied quietly. "We conquered it. You made this impossible vessel live." The sub's speed finally stabilized, 30 knots still maintained, the auxiliary system humming with the last reserves of its strength. Every creak, every groan, every vibration was a reminder of what they had endured and what they had achieved. The crew, exhausted, battered, yet alive, realized that survival was not simply the absence of death, but the triumph of ingenuity, courage, and determination. In the grey dawn light, HMS Persephone continued to glide silently, a living testament to audacity, improvisation, and the refusal to surrender to fate. HMS Persephone had finally outrun the pursuing German destroyers, its battered hull bearing the marks of the desperate escape. Twisted metal, shattered valves, and flickering lights testified to the ordeal. Crew members, exhausted and trembling, leaned against bulkheads and consoles, gasping for breath, grateful simply to be alive. Chief Engineer Edward Eddie Mallory, 35, slumped against the wall, oil and sweat streaked across his face, staring at the cascading water outside the portholes. "We made it," he whispered, the words barely audible above the hum of the damaged engines. Lieutenant Commander William Hargreaves, 38, placed a hand on Eddie's shoulder, acknowledging the brilliance and audacity that had saved them. "You didn't just make it, you rewrote what's possible under pressure," he said. The crew moved through the compartments, checking gauges, consoles, and makeshift repairs. The auxiliary propeller system, Eddie's improvised escape rig, fashioned from spare propellers, bearings, and metal plates had held, despite incredible strain, allowing the submarine to achieve unprecedented speeds of 30 knots, nearly double its standard maximum. The story of the mad engineer spread cautiously through naval channels, initially met with skepticism, until corroborating reports confirmed the sub's extraordinary performance and survival. In the following days, HMS Persephone returned to port under careful escort, its legendary speed and escape recorded in official reports. Eddie's innovation became a case study in emergency engineering, proof that ingenuity, courage, and quick thinking could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The crew reflected on their survival, knowing that every second, every adjustment, and every calculated risk had kept them alive. Their story would endure as a testament to human determination, turning scrap metal into salvation and transforming one man's audacity into a naval legend that would inspire generations long after the war ended. Years had passed since that fateful February night of 1943, and Edward Eddie Mallory, now older, walked slowly along the quiet dockyard where HMS Persephone had once rested in secrecy. The war had ended decades before, leaving behind scars, memories, and the faint echo of engines slicing through icy waters. The submarine itself lay in storage, stripped for parts, its steel hull dull and lifeless, the smell of oil and salt long faded. Eddie's fingers traced the bent, rusted edges of the auxiliary propeller system he had built in desperation, a crude assembly of spare blades, bearings, and steel plates that had once allowed a U-class submarine to reach 30 knots and escape death itself. He remembered the creaking of bulkheads under pressure, the pounding of German depth charges, and the terrified yet resolute faces of the crew as they clung to consoles, praying to survive another moment. No plaque commemorated his ingenuity. Few knew his name, and fewer still understood the courage and reckless brilliance that had carried them through the dark waters of the Aegean Sea. Yet Eddie smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "We survived," he whispered, addressing the ghosts of the men who had stood beside him, Lieutenant Commander William Hargreaves, Jameson, Finch, and the others whose courage had matched his own. The memory of their survival, the impossibility of the feat, lingered as a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. The story of HMS Persephone's miraculous escape had travelled slowly, first through naval channels, then into whispered legends among engineers and sailors who heard of the mad engineer who had turned spare propellers into salvation. Eddie remembered the feeling of triumph mixed with terror as the submarine surged through the waves, outrunning destroyers and evading destruction by inches. The water churned into froth by blades born of desperation and brilliance. That night, human creativity had triumphed over the impossible, a moment when courage, calculation, and a stubborn refusal to surrender intersected perfectly. Even in the silence of the dockyard, decades later, the lesson remained clear. In the darkest moments of war, ordinary materials could become extraordinary tools, and a single mind unafraid to defy convention could change the course of events. Spare propellers, a mad engineer, and 30 knots of sheer desperation proof that brilliance, courage, and ingenuity could turn the impossible into reality, leaving a legacy that would inspire generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.